After 9 years of being banned from the family, they had the nerve to show up at my new mansion, and I knew this would be their downfall. The nerve, the audacity, it was almost laughable. They thought time would soften the wound they'd inflicted, that they could waltz back into my life as if nothing had happened. But no. I saw through their charade before they even set foot on my property. This wasn't a reunion. This wasn't an apology. This was a calculated move, an attempt to reclaim control over what they'd lost when they cast me aside all those years ago. But things had changed, and they were about to learn just how much. I had spent too many years building a life alone, a life that I now cherished more than anything. The woman they thought they could break was stronger than they'd ever imagined. And as they approached the gates, I could already feel the satisfaction of watching their carefully constructed world crumble. My name is Susan, and at 72 years old, I've lived through more than I ever imagined possible. Life isn't always as graceful as it seems when you're younger. It's full of twists, turns, and unexpected moments that demand strength, resilience, and sometimes, an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Losing my husband, Paul, was one of the hardest things I ever faced. We had built a life together, a beautiful, humble life. Our house was modest, filled with the things we both loved, memories woven into every inch of it. The thought of being alone was terrifying when he passed, and for a while, I had no idea how to navigate that emptiness. But somehow, I did. When Paul died, I thought that my son, Brian, and his wife, Lauren, would be there for me. They would be my anchor, the support I needed to keep going. But slowly, over the years, that connection faded. It wasn't just the distance that grew between us physically, though that was certainly part of it, it was the emotional distance, the subtle but undeniable shift in how they treated me. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, that I'd been through tough times before and would rise above this one too. But as the months turned into years, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I had always been a proud woman, never one to ask for help unless I absolutely needed it. But there's something about feeling ignored, neglected, as if you don't matter anymore, that chips away at your self-esteem, at your sense of belonging. I started spending more time alone in my little house, retreating into books, gardening, and projects that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. But despite the quiet, there was a constant ache, an emptiness I could never seem to fill. My world had shrunk. It was a world of daily routines, of familiar faces at the grocery store, the coffee shop, the post office. I wasn't entirely isolated, but I was certainly alone. And loneliness, I realized, was something that could be felt even when surrounded by people. Brian and Lauren used to visit often, or so it seemed. Every Sunday, they'd come over for dinner, and Brian would tell me about his work, Lauren would chat about their latest purchases or plans for the house, and I'd listen, smiling and offering advice, even if I wasn't always sure they were listening. The visits became less frequent. At first, it was small things. Brian was too busy with work, Lauren had other commitments. But soon, weeks would pass without a word, then months. I tried to reach out. I would send a text or leave a voicemail, and sometimes, I'd hear back. Other times, silence. I began to question myself, to wonder if I had done something wrong. What had I said, or not said, that caused this rift? Had I been too overbearing? Was I simply too old for them to care anymore? It wasn't until one of those rare occasions when they finally called that I realized the depth of the shift. They invited me to a holiday gathering, but when I asked about the details, Brian's voice had a distant quality, like he was speaking to a stranger rather than his mother. It felt rehearsed. "It's going to be a smaller gathering," he said. "Lauren's family is coming over, and we've decided to keep it intimate." There was an uncomfortable pause, one I almost filled with a question, but I stayed silent. After a long moment, he added, "I'm sorry, Mom. It's just, we need some space." Space. The word hung in the air, thick with implication. I couldn't understand it at first. Was he telling me I was a burden? A problem? Someone who needed to be kept at arm's length? I had always prided myself on being independent, on not being the kind of parent who asked for too much. But hearing those words, hearing the coldness behind them, made me feel like I was no longer welcome, not just in their home, but in their lives altogether. That conversation was the turning point for me. I didn't say much in response, just a quiet, "I understand," before hanging up. But inside, something had snapped. I had been a mother, a wife, a caregiver, and yet, in that moment, I felt invisible. I wasn't just being excluded from a holiday gathering, I was being pushed out of their lives in a way that made me question my worth. My role had diminished in their eyes, and I had no idea how to fix it. I didn't tell anyone about it, not at first. I wasn't ready to admit how deeply it hurt. Instead, I kept busy. I poured myself into my work, my hobbies, anything that kept me from sitting in the uncomfortable silence that had taken over my home. But I wasn't really fooling myself. I knew the truth. I wasn't just a mother in their eyes anymore. I was a relic of the past, someone they had outgrown, and the reality of that truth stung more than I cared to admit. When Paul was alive, we had dreamed of growing old together, of spending our golden years traveling, seeing places we had always talked about. But instead, here I was, alone, abandoned by the very people I had given everything for. My world felt smaller with each passing day, the walls of my home closing in on me, the once warm and welcoming space now filled with memories I could hardly stand to revisit. But despite all of this, I had never truly given up. I still had my dignity, my sense of self. I wasn't about to let them break me. So I decided to make a change. If they didn't want me in their lives, then I would take control of my own. It wasn't easy, but I was determined. I wasn't going to be the lonely, forgotten mother who sat at home waiting for scraps of attention. I was going to build something new for myself, something that had nothing to do with them, something they would regret losing that I hadn't heard from Brian in months. It started slowly at first. We used to speak every month, without fail. Our conversations were once the highlight of my week. I'd tell him about the latest book I was reading, the garden I was working on, and the new recipes I'd experimented with. In return, Brian would update me on work, Lauren's latest design projects, their upcoming plans, and I'd listen with joy, feeling like I was part of their lives. We'd share memories of holidays past, laughter echoing through our voices as we reminisced about the times we all spent together. But somewhere, during the past few years, something shifted. I couldn't pinpoint when it happened. Was it the way Brian's texts became more curt? The times Lauren's responses seemed shorter, more distant? Or was it that, without realizing it, I had stopped expecting them to care? Slowly, without any dramatic event, my role in their lives diminished. At first, I convinced myself that they were just busy. Life was moving faster for them, and their work, their friends, and their social engagements had taken precedence. I was understanding. I told myself that I needed to give them space, that I shouldn't burden them with my worries. But as the months turned into years, the silence grew louder. The texts became fewer and further between. The phone calls that once seemed like routine check-ins became a rare and almost uncomfortable event. Brian's voice no longer carried the warmth it once did. His words were polite but lacked the depth of connection that used to come naturally between us. Lauren, on the other hand, had always been reserved. But now, I felt her absence even more deeply. The polite smiles she offered when we crossed paths had become a facade, a reminder of the growing emotional distance between us. I used to tell myself it was just a phase, that one day, they would come back, they would realize how much I meant to them, and everything would go back to the way it was. But as time wore on, I realized I was clinging to a hope that wasn't rooted in reality. Maybe they didn't need me as much as I thought. Maybe, just maybe, they were better off without me. It wasn't until the message came that I fully understood the truth of the situation. I had spent years convincing myself that they were just going through a phase, that maybe I was too overbearing, too needy, too persistent. But the message Lauren sent to me that cold winter morning, it shattered everything. It was a text, plain and simple, just a few words that left me breathless. The words themselves weren't cruel, not exactly, but the finality of them rang in my ears like a bell tolling, signaling the end of an era. We're keeping things small this year for the holiday. Lauren's family is coming, and we just don't have the space for you. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she meant to send it to someone else. Maybe she had accidentally left me out of the message chain, and once I pointed it out, everything would be fine. But the more I looked at those words, the clearer it became. I wasn't being excluded by accident. They had decided, consciously, that I wasn't a part of their lives anymore. It wasn't just about not being invited to a family dinner. It wasn't just about missing out on a holiday gathering. This message was a reflection of something much deeper. I had become irrelevant. I had become someone who no longer fit into their plans, their life, their world. They had moved on, and I was simply being left behind. The hurt was immediate, sharp, and deep. I felt like I had been slapped across the face. I had spent so many years giving my all, trying to be the best mother, the best grandmother, trying to be a part of their lives even when they seemed to drift further and further away from me. And now, this was the result. This was the reward for all the sacrifices I had made. I couldn't even find the words to respond at first. What could I say? How could I express how much their decision hurt? I had already tried to stay relevant in their lives, tried to keep up with the changing world around them, tried to be the understanding, supportive mother, but it hadn't mattered. They had cast me aside, and there was no way to undo that. I put my phone down and sat there in silence, letting the message sink in. I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment, tears threatened to break free. But I didn't cry. Not yet. The reality of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in, and I wasn't sure if I was angry, sad, or just numb. I hadn't expected this. I had been prepared for many things, but not this. Not from them. It wasn't until later, as I walked around the house, that I began to feel the full weight of their rejection. The kitchen, once the heart of our family, felt cold and empty. I stopped in front of the old family photo that sat on the mantel, one of the last pictures taken of all of us together. We looked so happy then, all of us smiling, unburdened by time or distance. How had we gone from that to this? How had we gone from being a close-knit family to this impersonal, distant arrangement? I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my hands. The very hands that had once cradled my children, the hands that had cooked meals, cleaned up messes, and wiped away tears. What had they become now? Were these the hands of a woman whose presence had no place in her family's world? It was a thought I couldn't bear to entertain, but I couldn't shake it either. They had stopped needing me, and I didn't know how to accept that. The following days passed in a blur. I didn't know what to do with myself. The loneliness seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I had always prided myself on being independent. I had built my life around the people I loved, around the work I did, around the small joys that filled my days. But now, it felt as though all of that was slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I thought about reaching out to them, asking why, begging for answers. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. I couldn't force them to want me. I couldn't force them to care. But I also knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I wasn't going to sit by and let their rejection define me. I had raised my children, loved them, cared for them, and now, it was time to care for myself. It was time to find my own path, one that didn't depend on their approval, one that didn't rely on their presence. And so, I made a decision. I would start over. Not for them, not to win their approval or make them regret their decision, but for me. I wasn't going to be the forgotten mother, the lonely grandmother who sat by waiting for the phone to ring. I was going to build a new life, one where I could find my own purpose, my own happiness, independent of them. The first step was clear, I would sell the house. It was time to move on, to leave the past behind and create something new, something that would reflect the woman I had become. The house had been full of memories, but now it felt like a prison. It was time to break free. One cold winter morning, as frost decorated the edges of the windows, I received the message that would change everything. It wasn't from Brian, as I'd hoped, but from Lauren. That name, appearing on my phone after months of silence, instantly sent a wave of anxiety and curiosity through me. I had been bracing myself for the moment when I would finally hear from them, but not like this, not in such a sterile, detached manner. I had hoped, foolishly, that maybe they'd come to their senses. Maybe Brian would realize the gulf that had widened between us, and he'd want to repair it. Or maybe Lauren, for once, would show a little compassion. But as I stared at the message, my heart sank. The words were blunt, so simple in their delivery, yet they carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. "We're keeping it small this year," it read. "Lauren's family is coming for the holidays, and we won't be able to have you with us. I hope you understand." The initial shock left me frozen in place. My eyes kept flicking over the text, reading it again and again, but no new meaning emerged. It was a finality. There was no hint of explanation or apology. No mention of why, just an impersonal statement of fact. As if it were so obvious that I should have expected it. The truth crashed over me in waves. I wasn't invited. Not just to their holiday dinner, but to their life. The things I had sacrificed, the years I had given, the moments I had missed out on, it all felt meaningless now. They were moving on, and I wasn't a part of their plans anymore. I was a footnote, someone whose presence no longer mattered. And the worst part was, I couldn't even get angry. There was no fight left in me. What was the point of protesting, of trying to explain the hurt I felt when they had already made up their minds? I set the phone down slowly, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. It wasn't just the pain of being excluded from a family holiday. It wasn't about the dinner table or missing the laughter of children running through the house. It was about being erased. I had poured so much of myself into them, into Brian and Lauren, and yet, here I was, alone, unwanted, cast aside. My heart clenched at the realization. I had spent years trying to be the mother they could rely on, the grandmother they would want to visit. I had given them my time, my love, and my support, and this was how I was repaid. I wasn't a burden, I wasn't a mistake, I had been a mother, a wife, a friend. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. I had become an inconvenience in their perfect little world, and now, it seemed, it was better that I be left behind. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the text, but when I finally looked away, the house around me felt colder. The kitchen, which had once been filled with the smells of homemade meals and laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. The pictures on the walls, the family photos that had once been cherished, now felt like ghosts of a life that no longer existed. The truth of their absence sank deep, and the realization was almost too much to bear. I had spent so much of my life trying to be there for them, and now, I was being pushed away. I wanted to reach out to them. I wanted to ask why, demand answers, and tell them how hurt I was. But even as the anger simmered inside me, I knew it wouldn't change anything. What was the point? Would they even care? They had made their decision, and nothing I said or did would change that. I walked around the house, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I stopped in front of the family portrait that hung in the hallway. It was an old picture, one from a time when we were happy, when everything seemed right. Brian was younger then, smiling brightly in front of the Christmas tree. Lauren stood next to him, her arm around his waist, both of them so full of life. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much I had been a part of that picture, how much my presence had meant. And now, here I was, staring at it like a memory I couldn't touch. As the days passed, the hurt began to give way to something else, something even more painful. The loneliness became palpable. It wasn't just the fact that I was being excluded from their holiday plans. It was the realization that I had lost my place in their world entirely. What had happened to the family dinners? The movie nights? The weekends spent together? I had once been the center of their lives. But now, I was a relic of the past, something they could no longer justify carrying with them. It was a feeling that crept into my bones, making me feel small and invisible. The house, which had once been the heartbeat of our family, now felt like a cavernous echo of what it used to be. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep myself busy with little tasks, projects, and hobbies. But the emptiness gnawed at me, and there was no escaping it. One afternoon, I decided to visit the garden. It was a small, peaceful spot where I had always found solace. But even as I wandered among the dead leaves, the frozen earth, and the bare trees, I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of abandonment. It was as though the garden, too, had died in the wake of their departure. The flowers that had once flourished in the spring, the green grass that had been soft underfoot, all of it had withered. And I realized that, in a way, I had withered, too. I returned inside, feeling the cold from outside seep deep into my bones. My heart felt heavy, but my mind was even heavier. How had I allowed myself to get to this point? How had I become the person who sat quietly by, waiting for attention that would never come? But then, as the cold dark of the evening settled in, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a burst of insight, it was a slow, steady realization that I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't continue to shrink into the background, waiting for scraps of affection from those who no longer valued me. I had given them everything, but they had taken it all for granted. I realized that it wasn't enough to sit back and hope that they would come around. It was time to take control. Time to rebuild, not for them, but for myself. I wasn't going to let their neglect define me. I wasn't going to let their indifference dictate the rest of my life. I had spent so many years giving and caring for them, but now it was time to care for myself. It was time to start over. And so, I made a choice to move forward. I wasn't going to be the forgotten mother, the discarded grandmother. I was going to rise above this, take the reins of my own destiny, and create the life I deserved. I wasn't sure how that would look yet, but I knew one thing, I wasn't going to be their doormat anymore. I was done being the invisible woman in the background of their lives. It was time for me to step into the light, to be the woman I had always been, the one who didn't need anyone's permission to be strong, to be happy, to be alive. Sitting in the silence of my home, I felt a deep sadness settling within me. The warmth of the sun streaming through the windows couldn't reach the coldness that had taken root inside. I stared at the walls of my house, so familiar, yet now so distant. It was as if every room had become a monument to a past life, one I didn't belong to anymore. I reflected on everything that had led me to this moment, the decision that had changed everything. The message from Lauren had come like a jolt of reality, breaking the illusion I'd been living in. I thought back to all the years I had spent giving, loving, supporting. From the time Brian was born, I had been his constant, offering love without expectation. When Paul, my late husband, passed away, I had carried that grief quietly, always putting one foot in front of the other, for them, for my family. And in the years that followed, I believed that this was how life would be, a series of moments where I was needed, a continuous cycle of giving without hesitation. I was proud of that. It was a mother's duty, I thought. But over time, I realized that giving so much left me with less. Less of myself. Less space to exist outside of the roles I played. Now, as I sat there, the weight of their absence pressing down on me, I had to confront the uncomfortable truth. I had allowed myself to become invisible to them. The world I had built around my family was built on the assumption that love and devotion would always be reciprocated. But now, that foundation had crumbled. It wasn't just their absence that stung, it was the realization that I had been holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I wondered how long it had been building, this emotional distance. I thought back to our last family gathering, one of those rare occasions when we all sat together. I could feel it then, the strain, the tension beneath the surface. Brian's distracted glances at his phone, Lauren's polite but empty smiles, the way the conversation always felt forced, as if we were all going through the motions, but none of us truly connected. I had told myself that it was just a rough patch, that everything would get better. But now, with the sharp clarity of hindsight, I could see how wrong I had been. It wasn't a rough patch. It was the beginning of the end. They had distanced themselves from me, and the hurtful reality was that I hadn't even seen it happening. It was so gradual, so subtle, that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. By the time I'd recognized the emotional void between us, it was too wide to cross. They had moved on with their lives, and I had been left behind, a shadow in a family I no longer seemed to belong to. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, steadying breath. The hurt was raw, but it was something I had to face. I realized that part of me had been holding on to an image of what I wanted our family to be, not the reality of what it had become. I had been waiting for them to come back, for them to realize the importance of family and make an effort to bridge the gap. But it was clear now, they had moved on. And it was time for me to do the same. But how? Where did I begin? I wasn't sure. I had always been someone who thrived on nurturing and caring for others. My whole life had revolved around their needs. Brian, my only child, had always been the center of my universe. And when Paul passed, that universe had collapsed, leaving me with nothing but an empty house and an aching heart. But I couldn't stay in this state of limbo forever. I couldn't let my identity be defined by the fact that they no longer wanted me around. I had to find a way to rebuild. I had to reclaim my life, not for them, but for me. But how? I didn't even know where to begin. I spent so many years living in their shadow, being the person they needed me to be, that I had lost sight of who I was outside of those roles. I hadn't realized it until now, but I was a stranger to myself. There had to be more to life than this, more than sitting by and waiting for the phone call that would never come. I couldn't keep living this way, feeling like a background character in a story I had once thought I was the author of. It was time to stop being passive. It was time to take control. I stood up from the couch, the decision settling over me like a blanket of clarity. I wasn't going to sit in this house and wait for something to change. I wasn't going to wait for Brian or Lauren to come to their senses and realize the mistake they had made. They had already made their choice, and that was something I couldn't change. But I could change myself. I could change my future. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. The house had once been a place of warmth, laughter, and love. But now, it felt suffocating. The walls that had witnessed countless family gatherings, holiday dinners, and long conversations had become a tomb of memories that I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the absence of Brian and Lauren that made the house feel empty, it was the absence of my own sense of purpose. I had been so focused on fulfilling the roles of mother and grandmother that I had forgotten what it meant to simply be Susan. I didn't want to feel like a ghost in my own home anymore. I didn't want to be stuck in the past, clinging to memories of a family that no longer existed. I needed to move forward, to create a life for myself, one that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or affection. It was time to let go of the house, the memories, and the image of what I thought my life should be. I needed to embrace what was ahead, even if it was uncertain. I didn't know what that would look like yet. Maybe I would downsize, move to a smaller place, or maybe I would even travel. I had spent so many years putting others' needs first that I had forgotten what it felt like to follow my own desires. But that was going to change. I didn't need to stay in this house to be happy. I needed to find happiness on my own, to create a life that reflected who I was now, not who I had been. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when the loneliness would hit like a wave, when I would miss the connection I had once had with my family. But I knew now that I couldn't wait for them to come back. I had to find my own way forward, even if it meant doing it alone. I wasn't going to be anyone's second choice anymore. I wasn't going to be an afterthought in someone else's life. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something, not hope exactly, but the beginning of something new. I wasn't sure what it would look like, but I was ready to find out. The days following my decision to move forward felt like an uphill battle, but also a strange kind of liberation. The first week after I made that commitment was spent in a haze of thoughts and emotions I hadn't anticipated. I had never truly been alone before. Not really. Even when I had Paul by my side, we had been a unit, and then when he passed, Brian had been my focus, my anchor. But now that anchor had slipped away, leaving me to float in an ocean of uncertainty. It was as if the fabric of my identity had been pulled apart, thread by thread. For so many years, I had been the caretaker, the listener, the fixer. The selfless mother who put everything else aside for the sake of her family. I had forgotten what it meant to do something for me. I had spent decades living within the confines of family expectations, neglecting my own passions and desires, focusing so much on giving that I had lost sight of who I was. But now, with a sudden burst of clarity, I realized it was time to change. I had spent so much of my life filling others' cups that I had forgotten how to fill my own. I thought about what I had always enjoyed doing. There were things I had loved but never had the time to fully explore. One thing kept coming back to me, crafting. I had always been a creative soul. From a young age, I loved working with my hands. It started with little projects here and there, making birthday cards, designing home decor pieces, and arranging flowers. But over the years, it had all been put aside in favor of more practical pursuits. For a while, I had even convinced myself that there was no room in my life for hobbies, that my focus needed to be entirely on family. But now that I had the space and the time, I realized it was exactly what I needed to bring back into my life. I started small. One day, I took a walk through my neighborhood and came across a yard sale. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery filled the air. The sight of old furniture, chairs with scuffed legs, tables with chipped paint, and cabinets with faded finishes, caught my eye. The moment I saw those discarded pieces, I knew what I had to do. These were not just pieces of furniture, they were potential. They had character, they had history, and they could be transformed. I bought my first project that day, an old wooden chair that had seen better days. The moment I brought it home, I could feel the excitement building inside me. I hadn't felt like this in years, eager, focused, energized by something that was just mine. I started sanding down the rough edges, stripping away the old layers of paint. With each stroke of the sandpaper, the chair began to reveal its true beauty, and I felt like I was revealing something about myself too. At first, I had no clear plan. I just worked on the chair, piece by piece, allowing the process to unfold naturally. I repainted it, choosing a soft, muted blue, a color I had always loved. The wood, once dull and forgotten, now gleamed with life. The project took longer than I expected, but I didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, I was lost in the joy of creating, of taking something broken and giving it new life. When I finally finished, I stood back and admired the chair. It didn't look like much when I bought it, but now it looked elegant and charming. The transformation was incredible. I realized that the chair was more than just a piece of furniture, it was a reflection of my journey. The person I had been, the person I had lost, and the person I was becoming. This chair wasn't just restored, it symbolized the restoration of me. The idea of working with furniture continued to spark excitement in me. I began searching for more discarded pieces. Each one came with its own story, its own imperfections, but with a little care and attention, I saw what they could become. I started restoring them, one after the other. With each new piece, I felt more connected to myself and more confident in my abilities. I wasn't just fixing furniture, I was fixing myself. But as my collection of restored pieces grew, so did the idea that perhaps this wasn't just a hobby. I started thinking about how I could share what I was doing. I had spent so much time focusing on my family's needs that I had forgotten about my own passions, but now, this was a passion that had the potential to become something bigger. The thought of turning it into a business, something I could call my own, started to take root. I wasn't sure how it would work, but the idea of doing something for myself, something that made me proud, filled me with hope. I began by reaching out to a few friends and neighbors, offering to restore old furniture for them at a small fee. I didn't know how to price my work yet, but I just wanted to see if people were interested. To my surprise, they were. I restored a chair for Linda, my neighbor down the street, and when she saw the finished product, she was thrilled. The transformation was dramatic. The chair had once been a forgotten relic, but now it was a beautiful, functional piece of furniture that fit perfectly in Linda's living room. Her gratitude was overwhelming, and it made me realize something. This wasn't just about furniture. It was about providing something people valued. It was about bringing something old and forgotten back to life, giving it purpose again. As the weeks passed, word started to spread. More neighbors asked if I could restore their old pieces. It felt strange at first, as I wasn't used to receiving such attention for something I had done purely for my own satisfaction. But the more I worked, the more I realized that this was what I had been missing: purpose. I wasn't doing this for anyone else's approval. I wasn't doing it for Brian or Lauren. I was doing it for me. And that was the first time in years that I had felt truly alive. Eventually, I began to get more ambitious. I started a small online account to showcase my work, posting before and after photos of the furniture I had restored. The feedback was positive, and the idea of turning this hobby into something more serious began to seem possible. I began looking into local markets and furniture restoration workshops, trying to expand my knowledge and network. It was exciting and terrifying at the same time. But the more I immersed myself in this world, the more confident I became. I had gone from being a woman who had no idea where she fit in the world to someone who was building something of her own. This wasn't just about making money, although that was certainly a part of it. This was about proving to myself that I could start something from scratch, that I could still be relevant, that I could still find joy and purpose in the world. I had spent so many years feeling like I didn't matter, waiting for others to decide my value. But now, I was the one deciding my worth. And that, I realized, was everything. But as my business began to grow, so did the doubts. What if this wasn't enough? What if I failed? What if I spent all this time and energy building something only for it to collapse? The fear was natural, but I knew that if I didn't take this leap, I would regret it for the rest of my life. There were still moments of loneliness. The silence in the house was deafening at times, and I couldn't help but think of Brian and Lauren, of what I had lost. But with each new project, with each restored piece of furniture, I was rebuilding. And I was finding strength in that. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control over my life. It was my choice, my decision, my journey. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. At first, everything seemed to be falling into place. The rhythm of my work, my passion, my newfound sense of independence, it was exhilarating. My furniture restoration business, born out of a desire to find purpose and joy, was becoming something real. The pieces I worked on began to take on a life of their own, reflecting the care and energy I poured into them. The old chairs, the forgotten tables, the worn-out cabinets, each one was more than just a project. It was a symbol of my transformation. I wasn't just restoring furniture, I was rebuilding myself. I poured myself into the work, and with each new project, my confidence grew. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers on social media began taking notice. People were asking me to restore furniture they'd been holding onto for years, some of it passed down through generations. The sentimental value attached to each piece added weight to my work, but at the time, I welcomed the challenge. It felt good to be needed again, but not in the way I had been before. This wasn't about being a mother or grandmother. It was about being Susan, a woman carving her own path. But with each passing day, I began to feel the strain. It was subtle at first, small moments of fatigue here and there, and I pushed through them. After all, I had been through far worse in my life. But the physical toll started to build. My back ached from hours of bending over pieces of furniture. My hands, which had once been steady and capable, began to tremble with the repetitive motions of sanding, painting, and restoring. I had always been proud of the work I did with my hands, but now they felt worn, their strength slipping away under the strain of constant work. I also began to notice the emotional toll. The excitement I felt in the beginning, the spark of creation, was starting to be overshadowed by pressure. I had taken on more clients than I had anticipated, each one bringing their own expectations. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of requests, each one more urgent than the last. Every time I completed a project, I felt like another one was waiting around the corner, demanding my attention. I was no longer working at my own pace. I was working at the pace of everyone else's demands. And the stress started to take hold in a way I hadn't anticipated. The worst part was the fear. I had always been a confident woman, the one people could count on, the one who got things done. But now, with every new request, with every piece of furniture that came into my workshop, I felt a little less sure of myself. What if I couldn't make it perfect? What if the pieces I worked on didn't turn out the way the clients envisioned them? What if they didn't appreciate the work I put into them? I had started out on this journey for myself, to reclaim my sense of purpose and independence. But now, I felt like I was losing control of the very thing I had created. The fear of failure crept into my thoughts, waking me in the middle of the night, keeping me up as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I had come so far, and yet I was afraid it wasn't enough. What if I couldn't keep up the momentum? What if my hands weren't steady enough? What if my work wasn't good enough? The physical exhaustion was becoming harder to ignore. Long hours of sanding, repainting, and restoring had taken a toll on my body. My hands ached from the constant movement, my neck stiff from leaning over furniture for hours on end. I had been so absorbed in the work that I hadn't taken care of myself. I had stopped stretching after long hours at the workbench, forgotten to take breaks to rest. The fatigue was starting to weigh heavily on me, and I could feel the strain in my muscles, the tension in my joints. But despite all of this, I pressed on. I couldn't afford to slow down. I couldn't afford to admit that I was struggling. This was my business now, and I had to prove to myself, and to the world, that I could make it work. Then came the call. It was a woman, a client I had never met, who needed my help with a piece of furniture that had been in her family for generations. It was a cabinet, intricately carved with designs that told the story of her ancestors. The woman, who introduced herself as Anna, explained that the cabinet had been passed down to her by her grandmother. It held great sentimental value, and she wanted me to restore it to its former glory. She mentioned that she had seen my work online and was impressed by my attention to detail. When she sent me pictures of the cabinet, I was immediately taken by its beauty. The carvings were delicate, the wood rich with history. But I also felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just any piece of furniture, this was someone's family history. It wasn't just wood and varnish, it was a symbol of everything Anna's family had built and passed down. And now, I was responsible for restoring it, for ensuring that the legacy it represented was preserved. The pressure mounted. I hadn't worked on a piece like this before. It was far more intricate than anything I had done up until that point. The cabinet was old, fragile, and had clearly been through years of wear and tear. The wood was cracked in places, and some of the carvings were faded. I knew that restoring it would take precision, patience, and skill, but I wasn't sure if I had what it took. The fear of making a mistake gripped me. What if I damaged the delicate carvings? What if the wood cracked further during the restoration process? What if I wasn't skilled enough to restore it properly? As I sat with the cabinet in front of me, I could feel my nerves getting the best of me. The pressure was suffocating. For the first time since starting this business, I questioned my abilities. The fear of failure, of disappointing Anna and ruining a family heirloom, was paralyzing. It wasn't just the fear of failure that was overwhelming. It was the realization that my entire journey had led me to this moment, and if I failed, it would all come crashing down. My dreams of building something meaningful for myself, of creating a life independent of my family's expectations, were on the line. This cabinet, this one piece of furniture, had become the symbol of everything I was striving for. The weight of it all was too much. I felt my breath quicken, my chest tighten. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to throw my hands up and admit that I couldn't do it. But something inside me pushed me to keep going. I had started this journey to prove to myself that I could do something on my own. And now, I couldn't back down. I knew I had to face this challenge head-on. I couldn't let the fear control me. I had to trust myself, trust my skills, and trust that I could restore this piece of furniture without destroying it. But that was easier said than done. I took a deep breath, setting aside my doubts, and began to work. The process was slow, painstakingly detailed. I had to carefully strip the old varnish, smooth the wood, and fill in the cracks. Every step felt like a test, but I moved forward, trusting my instincts. The cabinet slowly came back to life under my hands, the wood gleaming with a new finish, the carvings beginning to shine once again. It wasn't perfect. There were still small imperfections, tiny flaws that I couldn't quite fix. But the cabinet was beautiful, and I had done it. I had restored it, piece by piece, without letting my fear control me. And when I finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, pride. When Anna came to pick it up, she was overjoyed. She couldn't stop thanking me, her eyes welling with tears as she gazed at the restored cabinet. She told me that it had been her grandmother's pride and joy, and she couldn't believe how beautiful it looked now. That was when I realized that this wasn't just about restoring furniture, it was about restoring hope, about taking something old and worn and giving it new life. I had done it. I had faced my fears and come out stronger. The doubts, the exhaustion, the pressure, they were all still there, but I had proven to myself that I was capable of more than I had ever believed. The moment I finished restoring that heirloom cabinet, I felt a rush of emotions flood over me. Pride. Accomplishment. Relief. But beneath it all, there was something else, something much deeper. It was as though I had crossed a threshold. The task had been monumental, and I had faced my fears head-on. But more than that, I had learned something about myself. Something I had been afraid to admit until that moment. I had feared that I wasn't enough. That my efforts wouldn't be good enough, that no matter how hard I worked, I would always fall short. I had feared the judgment of others, the weight of expectations, and the thought of disappointing the people I cared about. But now, standing there with the cabinet in front of me, I realized that the only person whose judgment mattered was mine. I had done it. I had turned something broken, something forgotten, into something beautiful again. And in the process, I had turned myself into someone I was proud of. I was no longer just the mother who had been discarded, the grandmother who had been overlooked. I was a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet, who could create and build something with her own hands, regardless of who saw it or appreciated it. But despite the quiet satisfaction I felt, the fear still lingered. What if this was just a fluke? What if I couldn't keep this up? What if I failed again? The doubts crept in, whispering in the corners of my mind. They were louder now, threatening to undo the hard work I had done to rebuild myself. But the difference now was that I recognized the doubts for what they were, just noise. I had faced far bigger challenges in my life. The death of my husband, the distance from my son, the years spent questioning my worth. If I could survive those, I could survive whatever came next. So, I decided to keep going. I wasn't going to stop. Not now, not when I had finally found something that brought me joy. I threw myself into my work even more, not because I was afraid of failing, but because I was excited by the possibilities. Every piece of furniture that came into my shop, every piece that I worked on, felt like a new opportunity. It was as though I was rewriting my own story with each stroke of the paintbrush, with each layer of polish I added to the wood. But even as I moved forward, I realized that the true test of my transformation wasn't just in the work I did, it was in how I viewed myself. For years, I had defined myself through my relationships with others, as a mother, as a wife, as a grandmother. When those relationships shifted, when my family distanced themselves from me, I had lost a part of my identity. I had been floating, unsure of where I fit in this world. I had spent so much time waiting for someone else to validate my worth, to remind me that I mattered. But now, I was beginning to understand that my worth was never tied to anyone else. It was intrinsic. I didn't need my son's approval, or Lauren's warm embrace, or anyone else's acknowledgement to feel worthy. I had been enough all along. I had always been enough. The only validation I needed was the one I gave myself. And in that quiet realization, I found something I hadn't felt in years, peace. I spent more time working on my projects, but I also began taking care of myself in ways I hadn't before. I started to listen to my body, to take breaks, to stretch and relax after long hours at the workbench. I took walks, enjoyed the simple pleasures of life, and allowed myself to rest. I didn't have to work myself into the ground to prove my worth. I didn't have to sacrifice my health, my peace of mind, or my happiness for the sake of others. The journey I had taken, from despair to self-discovery, had shown me that true fulfillment didn't come from what others thought of me. It came from within. One day, as I was working on a new project, a table this time, I received a call from Brian. It had been months since we had last spoken. I hadn't heard from him at all after the holiday fiasco, and I had stopped expecting to. I wasn't angry with him anymore, not in the way I had been when I first received Lauren's message. Anger was exhausting, and I had learned that holding on to it only kept me tied to the past. I had moved on. But hearing from him now, after all this time, was unexpected. His voice on the other end of the line was tentative, unsure, and it made my heart ache for a moment. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about things, about us." I sat still for a moment, letting his words sink in. There was an awkward silence, one that had become all too familiar between us in recent years. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you," he continued, and I could hear the sincerity in his tone. "Lauren and we've been going through some stuff, and I've realized how much I've distanced myself from you. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The words I had been waiting to hear for so long, "I'm sorry," finally came, but now that they had, I found myself unsure of what I wanted from him. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, to open my arms and welcome him back into my life, as if nothing had happened. But I had spent too long waiting for others to define me, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore. "Brian," I said, my voice steady, "I appreciate your apology. But I've been doing some thinking too. And I've learned a lot about myself these past months. I can't just fall back into old patterns. You can't expect me to drop everything and pretend nothing's happened. It's going to take time." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing my words. "I understand," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "I really do. I've been selfish, and I've taken you for granted. I want to make it right, Mom." The tears I had been holding back threatened to break free, but I pushed them down. I had cried so many times before, waiting for this moment, for this acknowledgement. But this time, it felt different. This time, I wasn't crying out of desperation. I wasn't crying because I needed his approval or his love. I was crying because, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt like the woman I had become, not just a mother or a grandmother, but Susan. The woman who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, just like the furniture she restored. "I think we can start fresh," I said, my voice calm. "But it's going to take work. On both our parts." We spoke for a little while longer, but the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about fixing the past anymore. It was about moving forward, and that was something I could do. I didn't know exactly what the future held for me and Brian, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to wait for things to magically fall back into place. We had both changed. Our relationship had changed. But that didn't mean it was beyond repair. It just meant that we had to do the work, and we had to do it together. As I hung up the phone, a sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't just the reconciliation that brought me comfort, it was the realization that I had become someone I could be proud of. I had spent so long trying to fix everyone else, trying to make them proud, that I had forgotten what it meant to fix myself. Now, for the first time in years, I was the person I had always wanted to be: strong, independent, and unapologetically myself. It was a turning point. A moment when I knew that no matter what happened next, I could handle it. I was no longer afraid of being alone, of being forgotten. I had learned that the most important relationship I could have was the one with myself. And that was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The conversation with Brian had left me with a strange sense of calm that I wasn't used to. For years, I had been waiting for that moment, the moment when my son would realize how deeply he had hurt me and make things right. But when it finally came, it wasn't the triumphant resolution I had expected. It wasn't about receiving the apology I had longed for, or being reassured that my place in his life still mattered. It was about something much deeper. It was about me. I had spent so many years looking to others for validation, first from Paul, then from Brian, and later, from Lauren. I had lived for their approval, believing that if I just did enough, gave enough, loved enough, they would see me for who I was and what I had to offer. But as I stood there, reflecting on everything I had been through, I realized that I had been seeking approval from the wrong people. It wasn't Brian who needed to validate me. It wasn't Lauren, or anyone else in my family. It was me. For the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing that you have done everything you can, not for anyone else, but for yourself. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, piece by piece, and it didn't matter if the people I loved were on board with it. It was mine, and I was proud of it. That feeling, that quiet satisfaction, was something I had never fully allowed myself to embrace. But peace didn't mean that I had all the answers. It didn't mean that the road ahead would be easy. There were still obstacles to overcome, and some of them were looming larger than I had anticipated. Brian's apology was a step forward, but it was only a step. I realized that there was still much I needed to work through, emotionally and mentally, before I could fully move forward. I sat in the quiet of my workshop the next day, looking over the pieces I had restored. They were more than just furniture. They were my story, my journey, my transformation. Each one represented a step toward healing, toward reclaiming my independence and my worth. But as I examined the work before me, I couldn't help but notice something I hadn't seen before, a flaw. One of the tables I had just finished had a small crack in the wood that I hadn't noticed until now. It was hardly noticeable, but it was there. A blemish on an otherwise perfect piece. It felt like a metaphor for my life. I had spent so much time trying to make everything perfect. I had tried to fix myself, fix my relationships, fix the past. I had wanted everything to be just right, and in doing so, I had neglected the reality that perfection wasn't the goal. It wasn't about erasing the flaws, it was about accepting them. The crack in the wood didn't make the table less valuable. It didn't make the work I had done any less meaningful. In fact, it gave the piece character. It told a story of resilience and imperfection, something I had never truly embraced until now. As I ran my fingers over the crack in the wood, I realized something profound. I had been so focused on the idea of perfection, of achieving something that could be proudly displayed for others to admire, that I had forgotten what it meant to simply be. The cracks, the imperfections, the things that made me feel flawed and incomplete, they were all part of who I was. And just like the table, I didn't need to hide them. I needed to embrace them. For years, I had believed that I wasn't enough because I wasn't perfect. I had let the expectations of others define my worth, letting them decide if I was doing enough, being enough. But now, standing here in the quiet of my workshop, I knew that perfection wasn't the goal anymore. The goal was to live authentically, to create a life that was true to me, not to the image others had of me. I thought about Brian's apology again, about the conversation we had. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I had accepted that he had made mistakes, as I had, and that was okay. But I also knew that the relationship we had going forward would not be the same as it had been before. It couldn't be. And that was a good thing. I had spent so many years living for others, trying to fill the gaps they left behind, trying to make up for the things I felt I had lost. But I had finally come to terms with the fact that I couldn't fix everything, and I didn't have to. My worth didn't depend on their love or approval. It depended on me. It was time for me to take the reins of my life fully, to stop waiting for permission to be the person I wanted to be. The next few weeks were filled with small, deliberate changes. I started to take better care of myself. I took walks every morning, allowing myself time to just be in the world, without the pressure of work or family obligations. I started meditating, something I had never thought to try before, but it gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't realized I was missing. I learned to slow down, to appreciate the present moment, to stop rushing through life. I also decided to take my business to the next level. I had been working steadily, but I hadn't really allowed myself to dream about what could be. I had let fear hold me back, fear that I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't succeed. But now, I knew I could. I had done the work. I had built something from nothing, and it was time to see where it could go. I reached out to local stores, offering my services to help furnish their spaces with custom-made, restored pieces. I looked into ways to expand my presence online, to showcase my work to a wider audience. But perhaps the most important change was within myself. I had stopped waiting for validation from others. I no longer needed to be the person they expected me to be. I was Susan, and I was enough. I was enough because I had learned to accept myself as I was, cracks and all. It wasn't an easy shift. It took time and effort, and it was still a work in progress. But as the days passed, I felt a deeper sense of peace. The weight of past regrets, the burden of past relationships, began to lighten. It was as if I had been carrying around a heavy backpack, full of old baggage, and I had finally set it down. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely, without the pressure of trying to be something I wasn't. I was no longer the woman who lived in the shadow of her past. I wasn't the woman who defined herself by what others thought of her. I was a woman who had chosen to move forward, to create a life that was her own. And as I stood in my workshop, surrounded by the furniture I had restored, pieces of wood and fabric that had been given new life, I knew that I, too, had been restored. I took a deep breath and looked around at the space I had created. The walls were lined with beautiful, unique pieces of furniture, each one a testament to my hard work, my dedication, and my passion. They weren't just restored objects, they were symbols of my transformation. My journey from someone who had been lost and forgotten to someone who had found her purpose, her strength, and her voice. And in that moment, I realized something else. I wasn't just a furniture restorer. I was a creator. A builder. A woman who could take what was broken, whether it was furniture, relationships, or herself, and turn it into something beautiful again. As I stood there in my workshop, I knew that this was just the beginning. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was no longer afraid. I had faced my fears, accepted my flaws, and embraced who I was. And whatever came next, I knew I was ready for it. As the months passed, my life began to take shape in ways I had never imagined possible. I had entered this new chapter with nothing but a vision, a dream to rebuild not only my home but my heart. What began as a small furniture restoration project had transformed into a larger journey, one of self-discovery, self-worth, and the kind of independence I had always longed for but never fully understood until now. It was strange how much could change in such a short time. The woman I had once been, the one who clung to her past, who sought validation from others, who spent her life bending to the needs of her family, was no longer who I was. The shift wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. It took time, months, even years, for me to let go of the narrative I had created about myself, a story shaped by what others thought of me, by the roles I played in their lives. But now, I was beginning to understand something I hadn't been able to before. I didn't need to rely on anyone else to define me. In the past, I had defined myself as a mother, a wife, a caregiver. But in my quest to rebuild my life, I discovered that I was more than just those labels. I was Susan, and I was enough. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I didn't need to conform to what others thought I should be. The power to live authentically came from within, from embracing my imperfections and finding the courage to let go of past expectations. By letting go of the need to be validated by others, I found a peace I had never known before. I didn't just restore furniture, I restored myself. Each piece of wood I worked with, each table, chair, or cabinet I brought back to life, was a reflection of my own personal restoration. Every stroke of the paintbrush, every layer of varnish, every piece of fabric I used to breathe new life into an old, discarded item, they were metaphors for what I had done to myself. I had taken the broken, the forgotten, and turned it into something beautiful. I had done it with my own hands, with my own strength, and for the first time in my life, I was proud of what I had accomplished. But none of this would have been possible without the pain and the struggle. The heartbreak I experienced when Brian and Lauren turned away from me, the loss of my husband, the isolation I had felt for so long, they had all been part of the process. They had shaped me, tested me, and pushed me to discover my inner strength. Without those struggles, I wouldn't have found the courage to start over. I knew that I would always carry the weight of those past experiences with me. They would always be part of my story, but they no longer defined me. Instead of allowing my pain to break me, I used it as fuel to rebuild my life. I used it as a reminder that I had the power to create my own path, regardless of what had come before. I spent a lot of time reflecting on the lessons I had learned, not just from the furniture restoration process, but from everything I had gone through. The most important lesson, I realized, was this: it doesn't matter what happened in the past. What matters is how you respond to it, how you choose to move forward. The past will always be there, but it's not the past that defines you. It's what you do with your life now, how you face the challenges ahead, that matters. Looking back, I saw that I had spent too much time trying to live up to the expectations of others. I had been living for them, not for myself. I had let their judgments, their needs, and their opinions dictate my choices. But now, I realized that I was the only one who could determine my worth. I was the only one who could decide what my future would look like. The turning point in my life came when I stopped waiting for others to define me and started defining myself. I wasn't just a mother, a grandmother, a wife. I was a woman who had the power to build her own future, a woman who could create something beautiful, whether it was a piece of furniture or a new life. That realization didn't come easily, and it didn't happen overnight. But it was a quiet, powerful shift. I stopped waiting for validation. I stopped worrying about whether people would like me or approve of my choices. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I gave to others or how much I was needed. Instead, I started focusing on what made me happy, what fulfilled me, and what made me feel alive. It wasn't always easy. There were days when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. There were moments when I missed the closeness of my family, when I longed for the kind of relationship I had once had with Brian and Lauren. But I no longer defined my happiness by the relationships I had or the approval I sought from others. I had learned that true happiness came from within. It came from living authentically, from being true to myself. In the months that followed, I continued to grow and evolve. I expanded my business, slowly but steadily. I worked on bigger projects, took on more complex furniture restorations, and began building a loyal customer base. I wasn't just a hobbyist anymore. I was a professional, a business owner, and I was proud of the work I had done. But even more than that, I was proud of the woman I had become. I didn't need to seek validation anymore. I didn't need to be perfect, to please everyone, to make everyone happy. I was enough just as I was. The people who truly mattered in my life would accept me for who I was, flaws and all. And the people who didn't? They were no longer my concern. For the first time in my life, I had complete control over my own destiny. I wasn't waiting for anyone else's approval. I was living for myself, making decisions that were right for me, and embracing my flaws as part of what made me unique. The road ahead was still unknown, and there would be challenges along the way. But I was ready. I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead, because I knew that whatever came my way, I had the strength to handle it. I had learned to accept myself, flaws and all. I had learned to embrace the cracks, the imperfections, and the scars that made me who I was. I had learned that true happiness didn't come from what others thought of me or how much I could give. It came from within, from living a life that was true to myself, a life where I wasn't afraid to take chances, make mistakes, and embrace the journey, no matter how difficult or uncertain. And that, I realized, was the most important lesson of all. The past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was the one who defined my future. I was the one who would decide what came next. So, I stepped forward into my new life with confidence, with purpose, and with the quiet knowledge that I had everything I needed to succeed. I was ready for whatever came next. Because I knew, deep down, that no matter what happened, I had already become the woman I was meant to be. And as I stood there, looking over the life I had created, the business I had built, the people I had met along the way, the peace I had found within myself, I realized that the journey had been worth every moment. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been perfect. But it had been mine. And that was enough.